Good evening, and welcome to Narnia by the Fire, as we read The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe by C.S. Lewis, with permission from HarperCollins Children's Books. Our reading will last the next half hour. Now, let's step into the wardrobe.
Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the reading of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe from the Chronicles of Narnia by C.S. Lewis. Chapter 1. Here we go. Lucy looks into the wardrobe. Once there were 4 children, whose names were Peter, Susan, Edmund, and Lucy. This story is about something that happened to them when they were sent away from London during the war because of the air raids. They were sent to the house of an old professor who lived in the heart of the country, 10 miles from the nearest railway station and 2 miles from the nearest post office. He had no wife, and he lived in a very large house with a housekeeper called Mrs. Macready and 3 servants. Their names were Ivy, Margaret, and Betty, but they do not come into the story much. He himself was a very old man with shaggy white hair, which grew over most of his face, as well as on his head. And they liked him almost at once. But on the first evening, when he came out to meet them at the front door, he was so odd-looking that Lucy, who was the youngest, was a little afraid of him, and Edmund, who was the next youngest, wanted to laugh and had to keep on pretending he was blowing his nose to hide it. As soon as they had said good night to the professor and gone upstairs for the first night, the boys came into the girls' room and they talked it all over. "We've fallen on our feet and no mistake," said Peter. "This is going to be perfectly splendid. That old chap will let us do anything that we like." "Well, I think he's an old dear," said Susan. "Oh, come off it," said Edmund, who tried, and pretending not to be tired, which always made him bad-tempered. "Don't go on talking like that," he said. "Like what?" said Susan. "Anyway, it's time you were in bed." "Try talking like mother, then," said Edmund. "And who are you to say when I'm to go to bed? Go to bed yourself." "Hadn't we all better go to bed?" said Lucy. "There's sure to be a row if we're heard talking in here." "No, there won't," said Peter. "I tell you, this sort of house, it's where no one's going to mind what we do. Anyway, they won't hear us. It's about 10 minutes' walk from here down to that dining room, and any amount of stairs and passages in between." "Wait, what's that noise?" said Lucy suddenly. It was a far larger house than she had ever been in before, and the thought of all these long passages and rows of doors leading to empty rooms was beginning to make her feel a little bit creepy. "Oh, it's only a bird, silly," said Edmund. "Well, it's an owl," said Peter. "This is going to be a wonderful place for birds," he carried on. "I shall go to bed now. I say, let's go and explore tomorrow. You might find anything in a place like this. Did you see those mountains as we came along? And the woods? Oh, there might be eagles. There might be stags, and there'll be hawks." "Badgers," said Lucy. "Foxes," said Edmund. "Rabbits," said Susan. But when the next morning came, there was a steady rain falling, so thick that when you looked out of the window, you could see neither the mountains nor the woods nor even the stream in the garden. "Of course it would be raining," said Edmund. They had finished their breakfast with the professor and were upstairs in the room that he had set apart for them, a long, low room with 2 windows looking out in one direction and 2 in another. "Do stop grumbling, Ed," said Susan. 10 to 1 it'll clear up in an hour or so. And in the meantime, we're pretty well off. There's a wireless and lots of books." "Well, not for me," said Peter. "I'm going to explore the house." Everyone agreed that this was how the adventures began. It was the sort of house that you never seemed to come to the end of. It was full of unexpected places. The first few doors they tried led only into spare bedrooms, as everyone had expected they would, but they soon came to a very long room full of pictures, and there they found a suit of armour. And after that, a room all hung with green, with a harp in one corner. And then came 3 steps down, 5 steps up, and then a kind of an upstairs hall, and a door that led out onto a balcony. And then the whole series of rooms that led into each other and were lined with books. Most of them very old books, and some bigger than a Bible in a church. And so shortly after that, they looked into a room that was quite empty, except for one big wardrobe, the sort that had a looking glass in the door. There was nothing else in the room at all, except a dead blue bottle on the windowsill. "Oh, nothing there," said Peter, and they all trooped out again. All except Lucy. She stayed behind because she thought it would be worthwhile trying the door of the wardrobe, even though she felt almost sure that it would be locked. To her surprise, it opened quite easily, and 2 mothballs dropped out. Looking inside, she saw several coats hanging up, mostly long fur coats. There was nothing Lucy liked so much as the smell and feel of fur. She immediately stepped into the wardrobe and got in among the coats and rubbed her face against them, leaving the door open, of course, because she knew that it is a very foolish thing to shut oneself into any wardrobe. Soon she went further and found that there was a second row of coats hanging up behind the first one. It was almost quite dark in there, and she kept her arms stretched out in front of her so as not to bump her face on the back of the wardrobe. She took a step further in, and then 2, and 3 steps, always expecting to feel the woodwork against the tips of her fingers, but she could not feel it. This must be a simply enormous wardrobe, thought Lucy, going still further in and pushing the soft folds of coats aside to make room for her. Then she noticed that there was something crunching under her feet. "Oh, I wonder if that's more mothballs," she thought, stooping down to feel it in her hands. But instead of feeling the hard, smooth wood of the floor of the wardrobe, she felt something soft and powdery and extremely cold. "Oh, this is very queer," she said, and she went on a step or 2 further. Next moment, she found that she was rubbing against, with her face in her hands, that were no longer soft fur, but something hard and rough and even prickly. Why, it's just like branches of trees," she exclaimed. And then she saw that there was a light ahead of her. Not a few inches away, where the back of the wardrobe ought to have been, but a long way off. Something cold and soft was falling on her. A moment later she found that she was standing in the middle of a wood at night time, with snow under her feet and snowflakes falling through the air. Lucy felt a little frightened, but she felt very inquisitive and excited as well. She looked back over her shoulder, and there, between the dark tree trunks, she could still see the open doorway of the wardrobe, and even catch a glimpse of the empty room from which she had set out. She had, of course, left the door open, for she knew that it is a very silly thing to shut oneself into a wardrobe. It seemed to be still daylight there. "Well, I can always go back if something goes wrong," thought Lucy. And she began to walk forward, crunch, crunch, over the snow, and through the wood toward the other light. And in about 10 minutes, she reached it, and found that it was a lamppost. She stood looking at it, wondering why there was a lamppost in the middle of a wood and wondering what to do next. Then she heard a pitter-patter of feet coming towards her. And soon after that, a very strange person stepped out from among the trees into the light of the lamppost. He was only a little taller than Lucy herself, and he carried over his head an umbrella, white with snow, and from the waist up he was like a man, but his legs were shaped like a goat's. The hair on him was glossy black, and instead of feet, he had goat's hooves. He also had a tail, but Lucy didn't notice that at first because it was neatly caught up over the alarm that held the umbrella so as to keep it from trailing in the snow. He had a red woolen muffler around his neck, and his skin was reddish too. He had a strange but pleasant little face, with a short pointed beard and curly hair, and out of the hair there stuck 2 horns, one on each side of his forehead. On one of his hands, as I have said, he held an umbrella. In the other arm he carried several paper brown parcels. With what the parcels and the snow just looked as if he had been doing his Christmas shopping. But he was a faun, and when Lucy saw him, he gave such a start of surprise he dropped all of his parcels. "Goodness gracious me!" exclaimed the faun. Chapter 2. What Lucy found there. "Good evening," said Lucy. But the faun was so busy picking up its parcels that at first it didn't reply. When it had finished, it made a little bow. Good evening," said the faun. "Excuse me, I don't want to be inquisitive, but should I be right in thinking that you are a daughter of Eve?" "My name's Lucy," she said, not quite understanding him. But are you, forgive me, are you what they call a girl?" asked the faun. "Of course I'm a girl," said Lucy. "But are you, in fact, a human?" "Of course I'm a human," said Lucy, still a little puzzled. "Oh, to be sure," said the faun. "How stupid of me. But I've never seen a son of Adam or a daughter of Eve before, and I am delighted. That is to say," and then it stopped, as if it had been going on to say something it had not intended, but had remembered in time. Delighted, it went on. "Allow me to introduce myself. My name is Tumnus." "Well, I'm very pleased to meet you, Mr. Tumnus," said Lucy. And may I ask, O daughter of Eve," said Mr. Tumnus, "how you have come to Narnia?" "Narnia? What's that?" said Lucy. "Oh, this is the land of Narnia," said the faun, "where we are now. All that lies between the lamppost and the great castle of Cair Paravel on the eastern sea. And you have come to the wild woods of the west." But I got in through the wardrobe in the spare room," said Lucy. "Ah," said Mr. Tumnus in a rather melancholy voice, "if only I had worked harder at geography when I was a little faun, I should not doubt to know all about these strange countries. It's too late now." But they aren't strange countries," said Lucy, almost laughing. "It's only just back there, at least. Well, I'm not sure. It's summer there." "Well, meanwhile," said Mr. Tumnus, "it is winter in Narnia, and has been for ever so long, and we shall both catch a cold if we stand here talking in the snow. Daughter of Eve, from the far land of spare and the eternal summer reigns around the bright city of Wardrobe, how would it be if you came and had tea with me?" "Oh, thank you very much, Mr. Tumnus," said Lucy, "but I was wondering whether I ought to be getting back? Well, it's only round the corner, said the fawn. There'll be a roaring fire, and toast, and sardines, and cake. Well, that is very kind of you, said Lucy, but I shan't be able to stay long. Well, if you will take my arm, daughter of Eve, said Mr. Tumnus, I shall be able to hold the umbrella over both of us. That's the way. Now, off we go. And so Lucy found herself walking through the wood arm in arm with a strange creature as if they had known each other all of their lives. Now, they had not gone far before they came to a place where the ground became rough and there were rocks all about and little hills up and little hills down. At the bottom of one very small valley, Mr. Tumnus turned suddenly aside as if he were going to walk straight into an unusually large rock. But at the last moment, Lucy found that he was leading her into the entrance of a cave. As soon as they were inside, she found herself blinking in the light of the wood fire. And then Mr. Tumnus stooped and took a flaming piece of wood out of the fire with a neat little pair of tongs and lit a lamp. Now, we shan't be long, he said, and he immediately put the kettle on. Lucy thought that she had never been in a nicer place. It was little and dry. It was a clean cave of reddish stone with a carpet on the floor and 2 little chairs. One for me and one for a friend, said Mr. Tumnus, and a table and a dresser and a mantelpiece over the fire, and above that a picture of an old fawn with a grey beard. In one corner there was a door which Lucy thought must lead to Mr. Tumnus's bedroom, and on one wall was a shelf full of books. Lucy looked at these while he was setting out the tea things. They had titles like The Life and Letters of Tumnus, or Nymphs and Their Ways, or Men, Monks and Gamekeepers, a study in the popular legend, or Is Man a Myth? Now, daughter of Eve, said the fawn. And really it was a wonderful tea. There was a nice brown egg, lightly boiled, for each of them, and then sardines on toast, and then buttered toast, and then the toast with honey, and then a sugar-topped cake. And when Lucy was tired of eating, the fawn began to talk. He had wonderful tales to tell of life in the forest. He told about the midnight dances, and how the nymphs who used to live in the well, and the dryads who lived in the trees came out to dance with the fawns. About long hunting parties after the milk-white stag, who could give you wishes if you caught him. About feasting and treasure-seeking with the wild red dwarfs in the deep mines and caverns far beneath the forest floor. And then about the summer, when the woods were green and the old Tumnus on his fat donkey would come out to visit them, and sometimes Bacchus himself. And then the streams would run with wine instead of water, and the whole forest would give itself up to jollification for weeks on end. Not that it isn't always winter now, he added gloomily. Then, to cheer himself up, he took out from its case on the dresser a strange little flute that looked as if it were made of straw, and he began to play. And the tune he played made Lucy want to cry and laugh and dance and go to sleep, all at the same time. It must have been hours later when she shook herself and said, Oh, Mr. Tumnus, I'm so sorry to stop you. I do love that tune, but really, I must go home. I only meant to stay for a few minutes. Oh, it's no good now, you know, said the fawn, laying his flute down and shaking his head very sorrowfully. No good, said Lucy, jumping up and feeling rather frightened. What do you mean? I've got to go home at once. The others will be wondering what's happened to me. But a moment later she asked Mr. Tumnus, Mr. Tumnus, Whatever is the matter?" For the fawn's brown eyes had filled with tears, and the tears began trickling down its cheeks, and soon they were running off the end of his nose, and at last it covered its face with its hands and began to howl. "Mr. Tumnus! Mr. Tumnus!" said Lucy in great distress. Don't! What's the matter? Are you well? Dear Mr. Tumnus, do tell me what's wrong." But the fawn continued sobbing as if its heart would break. And even when Lucy went over to put her arm round it and lent him her handkerchief, he didn't stop. He merely took the handkerchief and kept on using it and wringing it out with both hands whenever it got too wet to be used any more. So that then Lucy was standing in a damp patch. "Mr. Tumnus," bawled Lucy in his ear, shaking him, "do stop. Stop at once. You ought to be ashamed of yourself, a great big fawn like you. What on earth are you crying about?" Oh, sobbed Mr. Tumnus. "I'm crying because I'm such a bad fawn." "I don't think you're a bad fawn at all," said Lucy. I think you're a very good fawn. You're the nicest fawn I've ever met." Oh, but you wouldn't say that if you knew," replied Mr. Tumnus between his sobs. No, I'm a bad fawn. I don't suppose there ever was a worse fawn since the beginning of the world." "But what have you done?" asked Lucy. "Oh, my old father now," said Mr. Tumnus. "That's his picture over on the mantelpiece. He would never have done a thing like this." "A thing like what?" said Lucy. "Like what I've done," said the fawn. "Taken service unto the White Witch. That's what I am. I'm in the pay of the White Witch." "The White Witch? Who is she?" "Why, it's she that has got all of Narnia under her thumb. It's she that makes it always winter and never Christmas. Think of that." "Oh, how awful," said Lucy. But what does she pay you for?" "Oh, that's the worst part of it," said Mr. Tumnus with a deep groan. "I'm a kidnapper for her. And that's what I am. Look at me, daughter of Eve. Would you believe that I'm the sort of fawn to meet a poor innocent child in the woods, one that had never done me any harm, and pretend to be friendly with it, and invite it home to my cave, all for the sake of lulling it to sleep and then handing it over to the White Witch?" "No," said Lucy. "I'm sure you wouldn't do anything of the sort." "But I have," said the fawn. "Well," said Lucy rather slowly, for she wanted to be truthful and yet not be too hard on him. "Well, that is pretty bad. But you're so sorry for it that I'm sure you'll never do it again." "Daughter of Eve, you don't understand," said the fawn. "This isn't something I have done. I'm doing it right now, this very moment." "What do you mean?" cried Lucy, turning very white. "You're the child," said Tumnus. "I had orders from the White Witch that if I ever saw a son of Adam or a daughter of Eve in the wood, I was to catch them and hand them over to her. And you are the first I have ever met. And I've pretended to be your friend and asked you to tea, and all the time I've been meaning to wait till you were asleep and then go and tell her." "Oh, but you won't, Mr. Tumnus," said Lucy. "You won't, will you? Indeed, you really mustn't." "And if I don't," he said, beginning to cry again, "she's sure to find out, and she'll have my tail cut off, and my horns sawn off, and my beard plucked out, and she'll wave her wand over my beautiful cloven hooves, and turn them into horrid solid hooves like a wretched horse. And if she's extra and especially angry, she'll turn me into stone, and I shall be the only statue of a fawn in a horrible house until there were 4 thrones on Cair Paravel, until they are filled, and goodness knows when that will happen, or whether it will ever happen." "I'm very sorry, Mr. Tumnus," said Lucy, but But please let me go home." "Well, of course I will," said the fawn. "Of course I've got to. I see that now. I hadn't known what humans were like before I met you. Of course, I can't give you up to the witch now. Not now that I know you. But we must be off at once. I'll take you back to the lamppost. I suppose you can find your way from there back to the spare and the wardrobe." "I'm sure I can," said Lucy. "Well, we must go as quietly as we can," said Mr. Tumnus. "The whole wood is full of her spies. Even some of the trees are on her side." They both got up and left the tea things on the table, and Mr. Tumnus once more put up his umbrella and gave Lucy his arm, and they went out into the snow. The journey back was not like the journey to the fawn's cave. They stole along as quickly as they could, without speaking a word, and Mr. Tumnus kept to the darkest places. Lucy was relieved when they reached the lamppost again. "Do you know your way from here, daughter of Eve?" said Tumnus. Lucy looked very hard between the trees, and could just see a distant patch of light that looked like daylight. "Yes," she said, "I can see the wardrobe door." "Then be off home, as quick as you can," said the fawn. "And can you ever forgive me for what I meant to do?" "Why, of course I can," said Lucy, shaking him heartily by the hand, "and I do hope you won't get into dreadful trouble on my account." "Well, farewell, daughter of Eve," he said. "Perhaps I may keep this handkerchief." "Rather," said Lucy, and then ran towards the far-off patch of daylight as quickly as her legs could carry her. And then, instead of rough branches brushing past her, she felt coats, and instead of crunching snow under her feet, she felt the wooden boards, and all at once she found herself jumping out of the wardrobe into the empty room from which the whole adventure had started. She shut the wardrobe door tightly behind her and looked around, panting for breath. It was still raining, and she could hear voices of others in the passageway. "I'm here!" she shouted. "I'm here! I'm come back! And I'm all right." Well, that concludes our reading for this evening. I'll see you tomorrow.
Well, thanks for joining us, and thank you to HarperCollins Children's Books. As you head into your evening, there's some questions to ponder in the description box below.